The woman standing on my porch didn't look like someone who had once told me I was the worst mistake of her life. She looked like someone's grandmother, soft cardigan, silver hair pinned back, a small leather handbag held in both hands like a shield. She looked diminished. She looked almost harmless. My name is Claire. I'm 43 years old, and I hadn't seen my mother in 20 years. I remember the exact quality of the light that afternoon, late October, the sky the color of old pewter, leaves plastered wet against the sidewalk. I had just come in from a walk and was still pulling off my coat when the doorbell rang. The sound of it was so ordinary. 2 low tones. The kind of sound that belongs to neighbors returning borrowed sugar, to Amazon deliveries, to the texture of a normal life. Not to this. I opened the door, and there she was. Dorothea. She didn't say my name. She said, "Is he here?" I stood there in my coat, one arm still half inside the sleeve, and I said, "What?" "Your son." She said it quietly, almost gently, as if we were resuming a conversation that had been briefly interrupted. "I need to see him, Claire. I need to see my grandson." The cold came in around her, past her, into the house. "Mom," I said carefully, the words strange in my mouth after 2 decades, "I don't have a son." She tilted her head. Something moved across her face, not confusion exactly, but a recalibration. Like a compass needle that swings before it finds north. Then she said, very quietly, "That's what they told you to say, isn't it?" And she walked past me into my house. I stood at the open door for a moment longer than made sense, the wind pressing leaves against the back of my ankles. I had spent 20 years building a life that had nothing to do with Dorothea. A small house in Millhaven. A freelance career translating medical documents. A cat named Francis. A handful of close friendships, one of which I'd had since college. A life that was quiet and mine and not haunted. I closed the door. She was already in my kitchen. The estrangement had begun the way most serious estrangements do, not with one explosive moment, but with the accumulated weight of 100 smaller ones, until one final thing collapsed the structure entirely. I was 23 when I left. I'd taken a duffel bag, my passport, and a job offer in Columbus that I'd accepted partly for its geography, 4 hours from Millhaven, far enough that dropping by wasn't casual. I'd left behind my childhood bedroom, the smell of my mother's house, my older brother Marcus, and whatever version of a daughter I'd been trying to be for 2 decades of my life. My father Gerald had died the year before I left. That was the thing people never quite understood, that his death hadn't broken my relationship with my mother so much as it had removed the only buffer between us. Gerald had been a quiet man, a paper man, someone who smoothed things over and translated Dorothea's moods into something livable. When he died, there was no translation left. Just her and just me and 23 years of things she'd never said kindly. I'd tried, after leaving, to maintain something. Phone calls, then letters, then emails. One visit, Christmas of 1998, that ended with me leaving 2 days early and crying in a gas station bathroom outside of Zanesville. After that, nothing. Silence that solidified over years into something structural, like scar tissue. She'd tried to contact me twice in the first few years. I hadn't responded. Marcus had relayed messages, which I'd received neutrally and not acted on. Eventually, even Marcus had stopped mentioning her, which I'd taken as a kind of permission. And now she was sitting at my kitchen table, her handbag in her lap, looking at me with those pale eyes I'd inherited and had always, privately, resented. "Tell me what you mean," I said. "From the beginning." She folded her hands around the bag strap. "He'd be 21, she said. Your boy." Marcus told me. I felt something go very still inside me. Marcus. Marcus told you I have a son. Had. She corrected herself softly. He said you gave him up. Years ago. And that he said you'd been protecting me from the truth. Protecting yourself. She looked at the table surface, then back up at me. "I'm not angry, Claire. I'm too old to be angry about it. I just want to see him before I die." Before she died. I looked at her, the loosened skin at her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands I hadn't noticed at the door, the way the kitchen light found every year she carried, and I understood that she was telling the truth. Not about the grandson. About dying. Something about this frightened me more than the absurdity of the claim itself. I don't have a son, I said again, more slowly. I never had a child. Not given up, not raised, not anywhere. Marcus is lying to you, and I don't know why. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, then why would he have the birth certificate? The following morning, I made coffee before 6, standing at my kitchen window watching the neighbor's dog circle the yard across the street. Francis sat on the counter, which I'd given up trying to prevent. The house was the same house it had always been. The blue mug I always used. The faint smell of old wood and radiator heat that belonged to October in this part of Ohio. Everything in order, surface level. I hadn't slept. Dorothea was in my guest room. I'd put her there because, despite everything, I hadn't been able to say get out, not to a woman who moved the way she did now, carefully, the way people move when their body has become something that requires management. She would leave today. We'd agreed on that, or rather I'd said it and she hadn't disagreed. But the birth certificate. She described it to me in careful detail before I'd finally gotten her settled for the night. A state of Ohio document. My name. A male child, unnamed or name redacted in her telling. She'd only seen it briefly, she said, at Marcus's house, sitting on his desk. She hadn't wanted to take it without asking. She'd assumed there was a story. She'd assumed I'd tell her when I was ready. What I was thinking, watching the dog across the street, that there is a specific kind of wrongness you feel in your body before your mind catches up to it. A low interior alarm. I'd felt it the night before and tried to reason it away. Now, in the morning, it had only gotten louder. I called my brother at 7. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. She came to see you, he said, before I said anything. Yes. A silence. Not the silence of someone surprised, I noted. I was afraid she would. Marcus. I kept my voice steady. What birth certificate? Claire. Don't. My hand tightened on the mug handle. Don't whatever me. Don't context set me. Tell me what document you showed our 71-year-old mother that has her driving to Millhaven asking about a grandchild. Another silence. Different this time. The dog across the street had found something in the grass and was circling it with intense focus. I didn't show her anything, Marcus said finally. She went through my desk. Why do you have a document with my name on it? He stopped. That's complicated. Uncomplicated. Not on the phone, he said. Come to Millhaven. Come to the house. I'll explain everything, Claire, I promise. It's not what you think. You have no idea what I think. 2 days, he said. Give me 2 days. Come to the house. I'll have everything there, everything I should have told you years ago. I set the mug down on the counter. Francis stepped off the edge onto my shoulder, which he did when he wanted something or when he sensed something I hadn't named yet. His weight there was familiar and small and, in that moment, unexpectedly grounding. Years ago, I repeated. Yes. I drove Dorothea to the bus station at 10 that morning. We didn't speak much on the way. She looked out the window at the gray Millhaven streets, the old brick storefronts, the particular sadness of a rust-belt October, and I watched her peripherally and tried to reconcile the woman beside me with the woman I'd left in my memory. The memory woman was larger. More certain. She had taken up rooms and hallways and silences in ways this woman no longer seemed capable of. At the station, she turned to me and said, "Whatever Marcus did, don't let it be another 20 years. I didn't answer. I watched her walk inside, slower than she should have been for her age, the leather bag swinging at her side. I sat in the parking lot for a while after she disappeared through the doors. There are people in your life who function as fixed coordinates, not because they're kind or safe or even good for you, but because they've been there so long that removing them changes the shape of everything else. Dorothea had been a fixed coordinate even in her absence. A point I navigated around. And something about the way she'd walked into that station, careful, diminished, carrying her own mortality in the set of her shoulders, made the coordinate feel suddenly, unsettlingly, movable. I called Simone from the parking lot. Simone was my oldest friend. We'd met freshman year at Ohio State, bonded over bad dormitory coffee and a shared philosophy professor we'd both found equally infuriating. She'd stayed in Columbus after graduation and I'd come to Millhaven, But we'd kept the friendship alive through 20 years and every kind of weather: my father's death, her divorce, the professional pivots, the ordinary griefs of middle age. She was the person I called. "Your mother showed up," I said when she answered. "Oh, Claire." Just that, for a moment. "Are you all right?" "She thinks I have a secret son." I laughed, which surprised me. "Marcus apparently has some kind of document. He wants me to come to the house. Do you think you should go?" I watched a pigeon walk along the curb with the purposeful directness of small animals. "I think I don't have a choice," I said. "I think something is happening that I don't understand yet, and not going won't stop it from happening. Do you want company?" I almost said yes. Almost. Something stopped me, not suspicion, not anything I could have named then. Just a small interior hesitation, the kind I usually overrode without examining. "I'll be fine," I said. Looking back, that was the first thing I missed. The house where Marcus still lived was the house where we'd grown up. It sat on Edgemore Street in the older part of Millhaven, a two-story colonial with dark green shutters that hadn't been repainted since the 90s. Our father had bought it in 1971, the year he married Dorothea. He died in it. Marcus had bought out my theoretical share of the inheritance 12 years ago for a sum that had felt fair at the time and that I'd used for my down payment in Columbus before the move back to Millhaven. I hadn't been inside in 6 years. It smelled the same. That was the first thing. Old wood, a trace of the pipe tobacco Gerald had smoked until his 50s, something floral that was probably a candle Dorothea had left on her last visit. The past doesn't just live in memory. It lives in the olfactory system, in the specific arrangement of familiar smells that your body recognizes before your conscious mind does. Marcus met me in the front hall. He was 57, no, 47. I corrected myself. I always aged him in my mind for reasons I'd never examined, and he looked it. Gray at the temples, the particular heaviness men accumulate in their mid-40s. He'd been handsome when we were young, in the blunt-featured way of Gerald's side of the family. He still was, technically, though worry had done something to the arrangement of his features. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Show me the document," I said. He led me to the study. Gerald's old study, which Marcus had made his own over the decades, but which still held Gerald in its bones in the built-in shelves, the dark wood desk, the lamp with the green glass shade that had been there since before I was born. Marcus opened a drawer and placed a manila folder on the desk surface. I sat down in the chair across from him. He remained standing. Inside the folder were 3 documents. The first was a state of Ohio birth certificate. The mother listed was Claire Elizabeth Dunmore, my maiden name, before I'd briefly taken and then returned from a marriage in my late 20s. The date of birth was listed as March 14, 2003. The child was listed as male. The father's line was blank. The certificate had the look of an official document, the right paper weight, the embossed seal in the corner, but something about the font spacing was slightly wrong. I noticed it the way you notice a painting hung a degree off level. Not immediately, but with a persistent low-grade wrongness. "This isn't real," I said. "No," Marcus said. He sat down across from me. "It isn't. Where did it come from?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the neighborhood, a leaf blower started up with an irritating whine. The ordinary sound of it was jarring against the atmosphere in the room. "Dad made it," Marcus said. The leaf blower continued its distant complaint. I looked at my brother across the desk where our father had once sat to pay bills and read the paper and inhabit the quiet of his own life. I thought about the way Dorothea had said "that's what they told you to say," the plural, which I'd registered and then let slide. "Dad has been dead for 24 years, I said. "He made it before he died." Marcus leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Claire, there's more. The birth certificate is the least of it. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for a long time." "Tell me what?" He opened a second document. This one was a letter. Handwritten on yellow legal paper, in Gerald's unmistakable cramped script. The date at the top was September 1999, 6 months before he died. I picked it up. It began, "Claire, if you're reading this, I didn't find a way to tell you in person, which means I was a coward about this too." The leaf blower stopped. The room was very quiet. I read the letter once. Then I read it again. Gerald's letter was 4 pages. In the first 2 pages, he explained. In the last 2, he apologized. The explanation was this: I had a half-brother. Not Marcus. Someone else, a man named Daniel, currently 41 years old if Gerald's timeline was accurate, born of a relationship Gerald had maintained for 11 years with a woman named Ruth Harlan in Columbus. The relationship had ended when Ruth moved her family to Portland in 1991. Daniel had been 11 years old. Gerald had supported them financially throughout the years of the relationship. He had visited Columbus several times a year on the pretext of professional trips. He'd been an accountant, and the pretext had held. He had, by his own admission in the letter, loved Ruth in a way he did not fully understand and had never resolved. He had not told Dorothea. He had told no one. Except, and here was the thing, he had told someone. Near the end, when the cancer diagnosis was new and the reality of it had rearranged his sense of what mattered, he had told one person. He had told Simone. I read that part 3 times. The letter said, I told Simone because I needed someone to know, and because she loves you and I trusted her with you. I asked her to tell you when the time was right. I've since understood that there is no right time for something like this, and that asking her to carry it was its own unkindness. I'm sorry for that too. I put the letter down on the desk. Something shifted inside me, not the sudden crash of a revelation, but something slower and more structural, like a foundation settling. 24 years. Simone had been carrying this for 24 years. Did you know? I asked Marcus. Not until 3 years ago, he said. I found Dad's papers in the attic when I was doing the roof. There's more, Claire. He opened the 3rd document. Dad also set up a trust. The trust document was the longest of the 3. I'm a medical translator. I work with complex technical language as a profession, but reading this document felt like being underwater. Words surfaced and submerged. I forced myself to slow down, to read linearly. Gerald had established a trust in 1994. The beneficiaries were listed as Claire Elizabeth Dunmore, Daniel Joseph Harlan, and contingent on certain conditions, any child born to either of them before the age of 40. The trust was managed by a Millhaven attorney named Elliot Holt. The value, as of the date of establishment, was $312,000, which, with 24 years of compound management, the letter estimated could reach considerably more. That's why the birth certificate, I said. Marcus nodded slowly. Dad wanted to make sure Daniel's side, or yours, would be able to access the trust without friction. The birth certificate was meant to be he called it a contingency document. A proof of relationship to the trust, in case anyone ever challenged it. A fake birth certificate isn't proof of anything. He was dying and not thinking clearly. Marcus's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been living with this longer than me. The certificate was a mistake. Holt, the lawyer, he apparently told Dad it wasn't necessary and wasn't legal and refused to file it. Dad kept it anyway. I sat with this for a moment. Gerald, who had been quiet and careful and good at smoothing things, Gerald, who had died holding all of this, had apparently been a more complicated man than I'd been allowed to know. Simone, I said. Marcus looked at the desk. I don't know what Simone knows. I only know what the letter says. I called Simone from my car, parked outside the house on Edgemore Street with the engine running and the heat on because October had gone cold in the way October does when it decides to be serious. She picked up on the 3rd ring. I'm at Marcus's house, I said. I've read Dad's letter. The pause that followed was not the pause of someone who didn't know what I meant. Claire, she said. Her voice was different. Some protective layer in it had been removed. You've known since 1999. Yes. Just that. Just yes. No explanation attached to it, not yet, just the single syllable of acknowledgement that collapsed 24 years of Saturday morning calls and shared meals and the kind of friendship that had felt, until approximately this moment, like bedrock. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought I would cry, and instead I felt something very calm and very cold settle over me, the way a hard frost settles, quietly, completely, changing the surface of everything it touches. He made me promise, she said, when the silence had stretched enough. Claire. I've wanted to tell you 100 times. He was dying and he made me promise and I kept it too long. I know that. I've known that. Did you know about the trust? A beat. Yes. Did you know it existed while we sat together at every milestone of my life? While I made financial decisions that would have been different if I'd known. Did you know while you watched me live? Claire. I'm not asking rhetorically, I said. I want to know if you knew. I knew, she said quietly. Yes. I knew. The heater in the car ticked quietly. A gust moved the remaining leaves off the maple in front of Marcus's house. I watched them briefly and thought, without particular drama, that I had been wrong about the shape of my own life for a very long time. I need some time, I said. I understand. I ended the call. I hadn't been building a real friendship, I realized, sitting there in the cooling car. I'd been maintaining the appearance of one. Or rather, I'd been authentic, and Simone had been half present, living alongside me with a crucial part of herself held in a locked room. And I'd never noticed. That was the part that stayed with me, longer than the betrayal itself, that I'd never noticed. The office of Elliot Holt, attorney at law, was on the 3rd floor of a downtown Millhaven building that had been a bank in a previous life. The marble floors remained from that era, clean and cold underfoot. I'd made the appointment the morning after reading Gerald's letter, and I'd made it alone. Holt was in his early 70s, which meant he'd been in his late 40s when Gerald had established the trust. He had the particular stillness of someone who had spent a career receiving information without visibly reacting to it. He stood when I came in and offered his hand and looked at me with an expression that was professional and, underneath that, something closer to relieved. I've been expecting someone from your family to come, he said, for some years. Then you know why I'm here. I know why you might be here. He gestured to the chair across the desk. Tell me which version. I told him. Gerald's letter, the trust document, the forged birth certificate, Dorothea's visit, Marcus's revelations. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk, occasionally making a small note on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Your father was a good man, he said, who made complicated choices. I've thought about him a great deal over the years. What's the trust worth now? Holt opened a folder. As of the last quarterly statement, $871,000. I had not expected a number that large. I had known, intellectually, that 24 years of compound growth from a base of $300,000 was significant, but the actuality of it landed differently. $871,000 in a trust I'd never known existed. Money that Gerald had built quietly over years to ensure that his secret family and his acknowledged family were both held. Who is Daniel Harlan? I asked. He's a high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon, Holt said. Married. 2 children. He knows about the trust, his mother Ruth told him when he turned 25. He's been aware of you in the abstract for a number of years. He's never contacted me. He was waiting for you to know first. His words when he came to see me 4 years ago. Holt paused. He seems like a thoughtful person. I absorbed this. A 41-year-old half-brother who taught history in Portland and had been waiting for me to know who he was. A father who had died with all of this inside him. A mother who had shown up at my door asking about a ghost. Why did Dorothea think I had a son? I asked. Holt looked slightly uncomfortable for the first time. That, I believe, is Marcus's contribution to this situation. What do you mean? Your brother came to see me about 3 years ago, as I mentioned. He'd found the papers in the attic. He was agitated. He'd formed a theory that the trust was intended primarily for him, as the oldest child, and that the contingency clause about grandchildren was a way of bringing Dorothea into the picture. I tried to explain the actual terms. He didn't fully accept them. Holt paused. I think Marcus told your mother about a child because he wanted her to push you, to bring you into contact with the situation. I don't think he expected her to drive to Millhaven. I thought about Marcus across the desk in Gerald's study, the look on his face, the particular brand of guilty relief of someone who has engineered a situation and is watching it run past his control. He wanted me to engage with the trust, I said. Without telling me directly. I believe so, yes. That's a remarkable thing for a person to do to their sister. Holt said nothing. The marble building held its old bank silence around us. Here was the thing I understood, sitting in Elliot Holt's office. The whole structure of what I'd assumed my history to be was built on a series of careful omissions. Gerald's omission to Dorothea. Gerald's omission to me. Simone's oath of silence. Marcus's misdirection. Each person had made a decision about what I could bear, or what they could afford to say, and each decision had been made without my consent. They had all, in their different ways, managed my access to my own life. The retrospective weight of that was considerable. What do I need to do, I asked, to begin the process? The drive back to my house took 40 minutes. I drove through the older neighborhoods of Millhaven, past the houses that had been grand once and were still handsome in a faded way, past the cemetery where Gerald was buried and where I slowed, but didn't stop, past the gas station at the edge of my own street where I'd bought coffee approximately 400 times. I thought about Dorothea, on a bus back to her house in Findlay, carrying a wrong belief in her chest. I thought about what it would feel like to learn, at 71, that your husband of 30 years had maintained a secret family. I thought about Daniel Harlan in Portland, a half-brother I'd never met, who knew my name, who'd been patient enough to wait while I lived my uninformed life. I thought about Simone, and here is where the calculation got harder. 24 years is a long time to keep a promise. I understood, intellectually, why she'd kept it. She'd made it to a dying man, and such promises have a particular gravity. But understanding the architecture of a decision isn't the same as absorbing its cost. The cost, in this case, was the entirety of what I'd believed our friendship to be. That was the grief beneath the anger, not that she'd lied, exactly, but that she'd been present all along with a version of herself she'd kept half-hidden. And I'd never suspected it. My own instincts had failed me so completely that I hadn't even known what to miss. There are things you can't unknow. There are ways of understanding your past that, once achieved, retroactively recolor everything before them. I had known this about other people's lives from the outside. I was about to learn it from the inside. I went home and sat with Francis in the kitchen for a long time before I made any more calls. 3 months later, on a Wednesday in January, I flew to Portland. The city was gray and damp when I landed, a Pacific Northwest winter pressing low against everything. Daniel Harlan had offered to meet me at the airport, and I'd said yes, and then for 2 weeks I'd wondered why I'd said yes, and then I decided it didn't matter, because I was going either way. He was standing near the baggage claim area with a handwritten sign that said Claire Dunmore, and I almost laughed because it was such a specific kind of absurd, a half-sibling I'd never met, holding my name on a piece of paper in an airport. He looked like Gerald. Not overwhelmingly, not so much that it stopped me in my tracks, but enough. The jawline. The way he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and his weight slightly forward. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I said. We went to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the airport and sat across from each other for an hour and a half. It was awkward in the way that such things are awkward, 2 adults trying to establish relationship grammar for a connection that has no established form. He told me about his wife, his children, his students. I told him about Millhaven, the translation work, Francis. We spoke around the larger subject for the first 30 minutes and then, gradually, moved into it. He said, "I want you to know that I didn't know about you until I was 25. My mother tried to protect me from the complexity of it. By the time I knew, he'd been dead for 6 years and you'd been gone from the situation for a while." "Gone," I said. "That's a word for it." A small, careful smile. Gerald's smile, faintly. "I've been curious about you for a long time. Not in a, I wasn't expecting anything. I just wanted to know if you were all right." That undid me slightly, and I looked at my coffee cup for a moment. "I'm working on it," I said. The trust had been in formal review since my meeting with Holt. A Portland estate attorney Daniel had recommended was handling his side, and a Columbus-based lawyer I'd hired was handling mine. The process was expected to take 6 to 8 months, during which both of us had agreed, through our respective lawyers, to divide the assets equally. No dispute. No contest. Just 2 people who had been equally uninformed about money that was equally theirs. I had contacted Dorothea by letter in late November. A real letter on paper, which felt appropriate. I told her about Daniel in outline, not in full detail. Not yet, because some things need to be said in person and some people need to be held while they hear them. I told her I was coming to Finley in the spring. I told her that 20 years was too long, and that I understood now that people do not always get the apologies they deserve while the time is right for them. I did not tell her about Simone. That story wasn't mine to tell. Simone and I had met once, in December, at a cafe in Columbus where we'd been many times before. She'd told me the full version of Gerald's conversation with her, the specifics of what he'd said, the particular weight of a dying man's request, the years of wanting to break the promise and finding that the moment never arrived. She'd cried. I'd listened. I had not, in that meeting, told her we were all right. I hadn't been ready to say that. But I'd listened completely, which felt like its own kind of statement, and at the end I'd said, I need more time. That doesn't mean the answer is no. She'd nodded. She'd understood. And we'd sat there for another 20 minutes without speaking much, because some silences are not empty, they're the space where something is being slowly reconsidered. Here is what I understand now at 43, that I didn't understand at 23 when I left Edgemore Street with a duffel bag. The story of a family is never the story any one member knows. It is always the aggregate of what is said and what is held back, of the decisions made in private that ripple outward into lives that never chose to be rippled. Gerald had loved two families and been honest with neither. Dorothea had built her life on ground she didn't know was hollow. Marcus had grown up in the same house I had and arrived at a different inheritance of damage. And I had built a whole self, a whole careful, quiet life in Millhaven, inside a framework that had crucial information missing. That should be devastating. And it was, for a while. But there is a difference between the facts of your history and the meaning you make of them. The facts had been managed for me my entire life, by people who thought they were protecting me or themselves. The meaning, that was still mine. It had always been mine, whether I knew the full story or not. I thought about this on the flight back from Portland, somewhere over the Rockies at 30,000 feet with the window dark and the plane steady. The life I'd built in Millhaven, the quiet house, the translation work, Francis on the kitchen counter, the routine of ordinary days, that had been mine. It had been real. The discovery of Gerald's secret didn't retroactively hollow it out, it just added a layer I hadn't known was there. Francis was at the neighbors when I got home. I collected him, thanked her, made tea, sat in the kitchen in the particular silence of a house you return to after absence. He circled twice and settled on my lap. I had a half-brother. He had Gerald's jaw and a careful way of choosing words and two children I might someday meet. I had a mother who was dying and who had shown up at my door out of a love for a grandson who didn't exist, which was the most Dorothea thing imaginable, loving something she'd invented because she needed it to be real. I had, still, the question of Simone. That door wasn't closed. I didn't know yet if I wanted it open. But I knew that I was the one who would decide. That was new. That was different. For most of my adult life, I'd been orbiting other people's decisions, Gerald's secrets, Dorothea's needs, Marcus's maneuvers, Simone's promise. I'd taken myself out of the family picture and believed that was a kind of freedom. And in some ways it was. But it was also a kind of removal. An absence from my own story. I wasn't absent anymore. In spring, I drove to Finley. Dorothea opened the door before I rang. She'd lost more weight. The cardigan was different, but the same species, soft wool, muted color, the fabric of someone who has given up performing warmth and just wants to be warm. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "Come in," and her voice was the voice she'd had before everything went wrong between us, before Gerald died and removed the buffer, before I left and the distance calcified into years. I came in. The house in Finley was small and neatly kept and smelled of tea and something I didn't recognize, lavender, maybe, something she'd added to the life she'd built in my absence. I sat at her kitchen table and she made tea and we began the long, imperfect, necessary work of learning to speak to each other without the grammar of old injury. I told her about Daniel over 2 hours and 3 cups of tea. She listened without speaking. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, her hands around the mug, looking at the table surface. Then she looked up at me and said, "He was a coward." "Yes," I said. And I loved him anyway. I know. So did you. I didn't answer immediately. Outside, a March wind moved the naked branches of a tree in her small yard. The afternoon light was thin and early and had in it the specific quality of light that belongs to the first days when winter starts losing its argument. I'm working on the past tense, I said, finally. I think that's the best I can do right now. She nodded slowly. That's honest, she said. It was the most generous thing she'd ever said to me. I drove back to Millhaven as the light failed, the highway sparse and dark, the radio playing something I didn't recognize and didn't turn off. I thought about the documents in Holt's office, the fake birth certificate, the yellowed letter, the trust document, the clean legal paperwork now moving through its deliberate process. All those pieces of paper. All that accumulated evidence of a man trying to manage what he couldn't say. I was not Gerald. I was not Dorothea. I was not the daughter I'd been at 23, young and wounded and leaving. I was 43, and I had the full picture now, and I was choosing what to do with it. That felt, more than anything, like the beginning of something real. What this story ultimately reveals is not really about secrets or money or the particular sins of a man named Gerald. Those are the facts of it. The deeper structure is something else. It's about what happens when the people who love you decide, collectively and separately, that you are better managed than trusted. Gerald set the terms first. He made the foundational decision to protect his double life by ensuring that Claire would only ever have access to a curated version of her own history. But Gerald's choice created a blueprint that others followed, not because they were cruel, but because once the infrastructure of omission is established, it becomes the default. Simone didn't invent silence. She inherited it from a dying man and discovered, year by year, that maintaining it was easier than the alternative. Marcus didn't invent manipulation. He inherited a structure that valued family order over family honesty and worked within it the only way he understood. This is the accumulation effect that rarely gets named. Deception doesn't require one villain. It requires a series of people making individually justifiable choices that compound into something none of them would have designed alone. Gerald's original secret was significant. Simone's silence was significant. Marcus's misdirection was significant. But each, in isolation, might have been forgivable. Together, they formed an architecture that shaped the entire lived experience of a woman who had no idea she was living inside it. What Claire had to reckon with, beyond the anger and grief, was something more vertiginous, that her instincts had not warned her. She'd trusted Simone completely. She'd lived alongside a best friend who was half present for 24 years, and the friendship had felt real, had functioned as bedrock, had sustained her. That is not a small thing to hold. It asks a harder question than, was I betrayed? It asks, what else don't I know about the texture of my own experience? The trust document, $871,000, quietly accumulating, is a useful symbol for what Gerald actually tried to do. He could not give Claire the truth. He could not be honest with Dorothea. He could not fully claim Daniel. What he could do was build something that would last beyond him, that would eventually bring the separate parts of his life into contact. The trust was, in some distorted way, his apology, an apology expressed entirely in financial terms because he lacked the emotional language to express it any other way. That, perhaps more than the affair itself, is the most revealing thing about him. And what of Claire's choice not to walk away from Dorothea, from the possibility of Simone, from Daniel? There is a version of this story where she takes the money, closes the file, and retreats further into the quiet Millhaven life. It would have been understandable. Instead, she moves toward the complications. Not naively, she holds her boundaries, she takes time, she insists on deciding for herself. But she moves toward. That shift, from orbiting other people's decisions to making her own, is the actual resolution of this story. Not the trust. Not the reconciliation. The shift. What I find most quietly devastating here isn't the affair, or the money, or even Simone's silence. It's the fake birth certificate, this clumsy, well-intentioned, deeply misguided piece of paper that a dying man created because he didn't know how else to keep his promise. He could not say the truth aloud, so he tried to encode it in a document. And that document, sitting in a desk drawer for 2 decades, is what brought a 71-year-old woman to her estranged daughter's door asking about a child who never existed. We do this, don't we? We build elaborate structures around the things we can't say. We create systems and documents and decades of silence rather than finding a moment, even an imperfect one, to speak plainly to the people we love. The question worth sitting with isn't why Gerald kept the secret. It's what we might be keeping right now, in our own lives, that someone else is building their entire understanding of the world around.